What if the person you trusted most turned their back on you? And in the pouring rain, with only your baby in your arms and a loyal German shepherd by your side, you had nowhere left to go. This is the story of a police officer who lost everything in a single night, but discovered that sometimes, when the world closes its doors, fate opens one much greater. Stay with me, because what unfolds next will leave you believing in resilience, loyalty, and second chances. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments below. And may you have a blessed and beautiful day. The small mountain town of Cedarbrook lay beneath a heavy gray sky, the kind that seemed to press down on the roofs and narrow streets until every sound became muted. Rain had started before sunset, a thin mist first, then a steadier fall that slicked the cracked sidewalks and dripped from the wooden porches of modest houses. It was late October, and the air carried the chill of early winter, sharp enough to sting the lungs with each breath. Into this damp twilight came Ethan Walker, 36 years old, broad-shouldered from years of police work, but now weary, his once black hair beginning to show strands of gray at the temples. His hazel eyes, which usually carried a calm authority, were shadowed with fatigue. He had just completed a long assignment in a neighboring city, a temporary duty meant to support an understaffed precinct, and tonight he came home expecting warmth and reunion. In one hand, he carried a heavy police-issued duffel bag, the fabric darkened by streaks of dust and rain. In the other arm, he cradled a small carrier that sheltered his 3-month-old daughter, Ella. She was a fragile, pale-skinned infant with a faint swirl of brown hair across her crown, her tiny mouth curled in the uneasy sleep of a baby who had traveled too long. Every so often she stirred, a soft whimper escaping her lips, and Ethan would instinctively tighten his hold as though nothing in the world could harm her if he kept her close. At his side trotted Rook, a 4-year-old German shepherd with thick black and silver fur, amber eyes alert even in the rain, and the muscular build of a well-trained working dog. Rook had been with Ethan since his first years on the force, trained in search and protection. He bore a faint scar across one ear, a mark from a rescue operation when broken glass had sliced him, and that scar gave him an even sterner look. Despite the fierce exterior, Rook was deeply loyal, protective without hesitation, and attuned to Ethan's every breath. The three of them, man, child, and dog, made their way up the stone walkway of the modest 2-story home Ethan had dreamed of returning to. He pictured it so many nights during lonely shifts. The front porch glowing with light, his wife Madeline rushing into his arms, the family together again. But the moment his boots reached the porch step, that vision shattered. A heavy thud echoed through the damp night as something large was hurled from the doorway. His duffel bag landed on the grass, splitting the silence, the force of its impact throwing droplets of rain into the air. Ethan froze, his hand still half raised from the motion of knocking, the infant carrier clutched tightly against his chest. In the doorway stood Madeline. She was 32, with delicate features that once held warmth and laughter, but now seemed hardened. Her blonde hair, which she used to keep in soft waves, was scraped back in a loose knot that revealed the sharp hollows beneath her cheekbones. There were dark circles under her eyes, not merely from sleepless nights, but from something heavier, a weariness that seemed etched into her skin. She was slender, tall, and always carried herself with a certain poise, but tonight her body trembled not from the chill, but from some burden pressing inward. She did not smile, did not step forward. Instead, she stared at him with eyes that had become unfamiliar, distant. Behind her, the house was lit by a single lamp that cast a yellow glow across the living room. Ethan's gaze swept the space instinctively, a policeman's habit of noting details. On the coffee table, he saw a white porcelain cup he had never seen before. Draped carelessly on the sofa was a navy blue tie that did not belong to him. Near the door, a pair of polished men's leather shoes rested on the floorboards, and just beyond the hallway, his trained eyes caught the flicker of movement, a shadow slipping away quickly, disappearing into another room. His chest tightened, his breath caught. He looked back at Madeline, searching her face for denial, for some explanation, but her gaze was hollow. "Madeline," he said softly, voice raw with disbelief. The rain struck his shoulders, soaking into his uniform, the faint badge on his chest dull under the water. She swallowed hard, then spoke with a tone that was flat, stripped of warmth. I've filed for divorce, Ethan. From here on, everything goes through Attorney Thorne." The word struck him like lightning. Divorce. His heart lurched, not only from the betrayal, but from the bluntness of it, spoken as if it were nothing. "What are you talking about?" he whispered, desperate. "I was on duty. You knew I couldn't contact you. It was an assignment. I came back as soon as I could." Rainwater dripped from his hair into his eyes, blurring his vision. Inside the carrier, Ella stirred, her thin cry breaking into sobs, as though the infant could feel the tension in the air. Ethan shifted quickly, rocking the carrier gently. "Please, let me inside, just to bathe her in warm water, to feed her, and then I'll go," he pleaded. "I'm not asking for anything for myself. I'm begging for our daughter." Madeline's lips pressed together, her jaw clenched. She looked down at the baby, her eyes narrowing. A flash of bitterness cut through the weariness in her face, and when she spoke, the words sliced through Ethan like a blade. "If you want her that much, then take the child with you. I don't need her anymore." Ethan's body went rigid, his trembling hand gripping the handle of the baby carrier, so tightly his knuckles blanched. He stood frozen as the meaning carved itself into his chest. Hours earlier, he had picked Ella up from Madeline's mother, the frail older woman who had tried her best despite failing health, who had confessed in a weary voice that Madeline had left the child months ago. Ethan had thought then that bringing Ella home would mend the fractures in his marriage, would be the gift that restored them. Now he understood the truth. The very woman who had given birth to Ella was the one casting her away without hesitation. Rook gave a low growl, sensing his master's despair, his ears back, eyes flicking between Ethan and the doorway. But before Ethan could say more, Madeline stepped back and slammed the door shut. The crash echoed like a gunshot in the rain. Ethan stood motionless on the porch, the baby's cries rising, the carrier heavy in his arms, rain streaming down his face to mingle with the numb ache spreading through his chest. He had survived danger on the streets, faced men with weapons, endured nights of fear, but never before had he felt so utterly alone. The rain fell harder, soaking him through, as he realized that he and Ella now had no home. Rain lashed harder against the roofs of Cedarbrook as night deepened, each gust of wind driving cold sheets of water into the narrow streets. The small mountain town, already quiet most evenings, now felt deserted, its shop fronts shuttered, its sidewalks glistening in the lamplight. The storm had turned the world into a place of shadows and puddles, and Ethan Walker trudged through it, clutching the carrier that held his infant daughter close to his chest, his uniform soaked through. At his side, Rook kept pace, fur heavy with rain, but body taut with vigilance, his amber eyes flashing each time a car passed on the distant road. Ethan moved quickly, but with no destination. His home was closed to him, his wife's betrayal still burning like an open wound. He had nowhere else to go. The only thought pounding in his mind was Ella, her safety, her warmth, the tiny cries that now broke into a feverish whimper. Her skin felt hot when his fingers brushed her cheek, her breathing shallow. Panic clawed at him. He had seen men bleed out, had steadied his nerves in standoffs, but the sight of his daughter's fever terrified him more than any gun. He ducked under an awning of an old convenience store, locked up for the night. The cover shielded them only slightly from the storm, but it was not enough. Ella coughed, her little chest rising too fast. Ethan fumbled for his phone, hands trembling, and called the emergency line. The voice that answered belonged to a nurse on night duty, calm but brisk. Her name was Caroline Mills, a woman in her late 40s with a voice that carried both authority and maternal steadiness. Though Ethan couldn't see her, her reputation was known in town. Caroline had worked at the small clinic in Cedarbrook for decades. A sturdy woman with auburn hair streaked with gray, a square jaw that made her look unflinching, though those who knew her said she carried scars from losing her own child years before. That loss had made her fiercely protective of infants. "Describe her symptoms," Caroline instructed. Ethan's voice cracked as he listed them: fever, crying, wet clothes. She gave him precise steps. Remove the damp fabric, dry her with anything soft, keep her skin against his to share body heat, and find shelter immediately. He obeyed, stripping off his undershirt, rubbing Ella gently, then pressing her to his chest as Rook watched, whining low as though urging him on. "You'll need a blanket or something to insulate," Caroline added. "There's an old maintenance shed behind the tailor's shop on Ashworth Street. Key should still be under the step. Go there. It's dry. It's safe enough for the night." Ethan thanked her with a ragged voice and ended the call. He hurried through the rain, his boots splashing through deepening puddles, his arm tightening around Ella, who whimpered softly now against his heartbeat. At last, he found the squat outline of the shed, tucked behind a row of darkened shops. The wooden door was weather-worn, the paint peeling, but under the step he found the key as Caroline had said. Inside, the air was musty, heavy with the smell of old lumber and mothballs. But it was dry. Ethan laid down his duffel, spread what little fabric he had, and sat with Ella in his arms, pulling Rook close to their side. The German shepherd shook water from his fur, then pressed against Ethan's leg, radiating warmth, his loyalty unshaken. As the hours passed, Ella's fever lingered, her cries dwindling to weak whimpers. Ethan sang softly, his deep voice unsteady but rhythmic, the same lullaby his mother had once sung to him when storms rattled their windows. His eyes stung, not from the rain anymore, but from the weight of helplessness. Outside, the storm hammered the tin roof, steady as a drum. In another part of town, the contrast could not have been sharper. Madeline sat in the warmly lit dining room of Mark Halstead's house. Mark was a man of 40, tall with sleek dark hair combed immaculately, a sharp jawline, and a smile practiced enough to charm investors. He carried himself with the confidence of wealth, wearing tailored suits even at home. Those who worked with him whispered that he had grown up poor in a steelworker's family, a childhood of hunger etched into his ambition until he became ruthless in business. He had clawed his way up through real estate and small investments, and now wore success like armor. Madeline, sitting across from him, had traded her weary frown for a tentative smile, drinking wine from a crystal glass as though trying to erase the memory of her husband's pleading face. Mark reached across the table, his hand brushing hers, his voice low and silky. "You made the right choice. Ethan could never give you the life you deserve. With me, you won't have to worry about bills, about being trapped in that small house. You'll be free." Madeline's eyes, tired though they were, lit faintly at his words. She had once been the town's admired beauty, slender, elegant, with a laugh that used to fill rooms. But motherhood had drained her, and Ethan's long absences had left her lonely, resentful. Mark had entered at the perfect moment, offering glamour where there had only been routine. She leaned into his promises, convincing herself it was love, though deep down, it was escape. Meanwhile, back in the shed, Ethan checked Ella's temperature again, pressing his lips against her forehead. It was still warm, but not as alarming as before. He remembered Caroline's instructions, adjusted the blanket, and whispered reassurances. Rook shifted beside them, ears perked at every sound outside, ever watchful. At one point, the creak of footsteps in the alley made Ethan tense, his hand instinctively going to the baton he still carried at his belt. But the figure that passed by the crack of the door was only a boy delivering late papers, sprinting through the storm, his silhouette gone in seconds. Rook gave a soft growl anyway, a reminder that they were vulnerable. Hours stretched long. The storm softened to a drizzle. Ethan's eyes closed and opened again, heavy with exhaustion. In his mind, he replayed the door slamming, Madeline's voice, the stranger's shoes by the hallway. Betrayal cut deeper than the storm. Yet each time Ella stirred, each time she whimpered and pressed her tiny face against his chest, he felt something anchor him, something stronger than despair. By dawn, pale light seeped through the cracks in the wood. The rain had slowed, mist curling along the streets. Ella's breathing was steadier, her fever easing, though she remained fragile. Ethan exhaled, relief washing through him like sunlight breaking clouds. Rook nudged his leg, tail swishing once, as if to say they had survived the night together. Ethan sat there in silence, drenched in fatigue but steadied by resolve. He had no answers for what came next, no home, no wife, no clear path. But he had his daughter, he had Rook, and for now, they were safe. Morning in Cedar Brook dawned gray and reluctant. The rain from the night before, reduced now to a fine mist that clung to the streets like smoke. The small town was slow to wake. A lone truck rumbled down Main Street, its tires hissing on wet pavement, and shopkeepers emerged in coats, unlocking doors with movements heavy from the chill. In the abandoned shed behind the tailor's shop, Ethan Walker stirred awake. His back ached from the hard floor, but the first sound he heard was not the rain. It was the soft, even breaths of Ella, still curled against him beneath the makeshift blanket. Relief coursed through him. The fever seemed lighter now, her skin no longer burning to the touch. Rook lay beside them, head resting on his paws, his amber eyes already open and alert, scanning the shed as if guarding against unseen threats. Ethan sat up slowly, rubbing his stiff neck. In the dim light seeping through cracked boards, he noticed papers scattered near a wooden shelf, edges curled and damp. At first he thought they were old receipts or discarded advertisements, but when he picked them up, his heart stilled. These were letters. He recognized Madeline's handwriting immediately, slanted, elegant, written in the ink he had once watched her use to pen love notes to him in their younger days. His eyes darted over the words, and each sentence carved deeper wounds. They were addressed to Mark Halstead. They spoke of nights spent together, of resentment toward Ethan's long absences, of plans whispered to a lover about building a new life once Ethan was no longer in the picture. His hands trembled as he turned page after page. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't weakness of a single night. It was deliberate, premeditated betrayal. Ella stirred, her tiny whimper breaking his trance. He placed the letters down and lifted her gently, kissing her damp hair, murmuring promises he wasn't sure he could keep, but knew he had to. Rook pressed closer, his fur brushing Ethan's leg, as though sensing the heaviness that had fallen on his master. The door creaked faintly and a new figure appeared outside, her small frame silhouetted against the pale morning. It was Margaret Holloway, the elderly neighbor from 2 houses down the street. She was in her late 70s, with a wiry build and silver hair pulled back into a tidy bun. Her eyes, pale blue and still sharp despite age, held both kindness and quiet steel. Margaret had lived alone for years, a widow who had once run the town's modest library before it closed. Her hands, veined and thin, carried a basket wrapped in cloth. She stepped into the shed without hesitation, brushing raindrops from her coat. "I thought I might find you here," she said softly. "You and the baby looked half drowned last night." She placed the basket down. Inside were small rolls of bread, a jar of honey, and a woolen blanket worn but clean. Ethan rose, embarrassed, his uniform disheveled, his eyes red. "I didn't want to trouble anyone." "Nonsense," Margaret replied firmly, her voice the kind that had once hushed rowdy children in the library. "You're already in enough trouble, son. You need strength." She looked down at Ella, who blinked sleepily at her, and Margaret's lined face softened. "She's beautiful. She deserves better than being left in the cold by her own mother." A shadow passed over her eyes. Margaret had lost her only child decades ago to a car accident. It had carved a loneliness into her life that never left, though she rarely spoke of it. Perhaps that was why she carried such fierce protectiveness toward other children now. Ethan hesitated, then confessed in a low voice. "Madeline told me she didn't need Ella anymore." The words tasted bitter even as he said them. Margaret's lips pressed tight, her eyes flashing with indignation. "Then she's lost her soul as well as her sense," she muttered. She glanced at the scattered letters on the floor, picking one up briefly before handing it back. "I see the shape of this. She's been weaving this web for months, but don't let her lies define your truth. You have your daughter. You have that loyal creature at your side." Her gaze shifted to Rook, who sat upright, tail sweeping the floor once in acknowledgement. As Ethan tucked the blanket around Ella, Rook suddenly stiffened. His ears shot up, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Ethan froze, following his gaze toward the crack between the boards. In the alley beyond, half concealed by fog, stood a figure. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, with slick dark hair and a sharp coat that glistened faintly with moisture. He was watching. Even at a distance, Ethan recognized Mark Halstead. The man didn't approach, but his posture was one of possession, as if surveying something he believed already his. When Rook's growl deepened, Mark turned sharply and vanished into the mist, his shoes splashing in puddles until the sound disappeared. Margaret's hand closed on Ethan's arm, her grip surprisingly strong for her frail frame. "He'll circle like a hawk, but hawks can be driven off. You must not falter." Ethan nodded slowly, though inside his chest a storm of anger and fear swirled. He was not only betrayed, he was being watched, calculated against, treated as an obstacle to be removed. He looked down at Ella, her tiny lips moving in sleep, and at Rook, whose loyalty was steady as stone. A resolve began to kindle within him, fragile but growing, like fire coaxed from wet wood. For now, though, survival came first. He accepted Margaret's blanket, thanked her with a sincerity that made his voice catch, and settled Ella into the warmth. The shed was not a home, but in that moment, surrounded by betrayal and shadows, it became a sanctuary, just enough to hold them through the storm of what was coming. The sun struggled to break through Cedarbrook's low clouds, casting only a muted glow over the town as Ethan Walker made his way along the damp streets. He carried Ella close against his chest in the soft woolen blanket Margaret had given him, while Rook padded loyally at his side, head high, scanning the sidewalks as though every pedestrian were a potential threat. The shed had been a poor shelter, and Ethan knew they could not stay there forever. He needed answers, and he needed a plan. Madeline's letters had shown that her betrayal wasn't sudden. It was deliberate, sharpened by Mark's presence. And now, after Mark's silent surveillance outside the shed, Ethan knew this was no domestic spat. It was a campaign. Margaret had pressed a name into his hand before leaving that morning. Daniel Brooks, a young lawyer who had returned to Cedarbrook after years working in the city. Ethan knew the name faintly. Daniel's father had once been Cedarbrook's respected police chief, a man who died of a sudden heart attack while still in office. Daniel, then just starting law school, had come home for the funeral, his grief making him more withdrawn, quieter. Some people said that loss made him relentless in his pursuit of justice, as if he were carrying forward the work his father had left behind. Daniel's office was modest, tucked above the town's old hardware store, a plain door with a brass plaque. Inside, the room was lined with shelves of thick legal texts and framed certificates. Behind the desk sat Daniel Brooks, late 30s, tall and lean, with sandy blonde hair combed back neatly. He wore a simple gray suit, a bit frayed at the cuffs, and thin-rimmed glasses that magnified eyes the color of pale moss. His face was angular, not striking but thoughtful, his gaze steady with the sort of focus that unnerved liars. Though he carried an air of formality, there was also an undercurrent of empathy in the way his brows furrowed when Ethan entered, carrying the baby, and with Rook at his side. "Ethan Walker," Daniel said, rising to shake his hand. His grip was firm, his voice low and measured. "I heard about what happened at your house. Sit down. Tell me everything." Ethan hesitated, but exhaustion loosened his reserve. He recounted the night, the slammed door, Madeline's cold words, the letters, Mark's looming presence. As he spoke, his voice cracked, but Daniel never interrupted, his pen still, his gaze unwavering. Only when Ethan fell silent did Daniel lean forward, folding his hands. "You're not just fighting for your marriage," Daniel said. "You're fighting for custody. And family court doesn't care about betrayals of the heart. It cares about who can provide stability for the child. That's our angle. We don't need to prove adultery. We need to prove neglect." Ethan's jaw tightened. "She said she didn't need Ella anymore." Daniel's eyes hardened. "Then we document every detail, every feeding, every fever, every time she's with you. You'll keep a journal, dates, times, medicine, what she eats, how she sleeps. Family court judges want evidence of care, not emotion. And we'll need witnesses, Margaret, anyone else who saw Madeline abandon her child. That will matter more than anything." Ethan nodded, his chest heavy, but steadied by Daniel's clear tone. For the first time since the night on the porch, he felt something akin to direction. A mission. At that moment, Rook, who had been lying quietly by Ethan's feet, suddenly sprang up with a sharp bark. Ethan turned, startled, just as the office door opened and a young boy tumbled in, clutching a toy truck. Behind him hurried a woman, Claire Morton, Daniel's secretary. Claire was in her mid-20s, with curly auburn hair pulled back loosely and a scattering of freckles across her cheeks. She was petite, often moving quickly, as though the world were always half a step ahead of her. Her young son, Caleb, about 6 years old, had followed her in against her instructions. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Brooks," Claire said, cheeks flushed. "Caleb, you can't just run into people's meetings." But before she could usher him out, Caleb tripped on the rug. The boy pitched forward, the toy clattering across the floor. In a flash, Rook darted forward, not to snap or growl, but to catch the boy with his strong body, steadying him before he could hit the desk corner. Caleb let out a surprised laugh, his small hand clutching Rook's fur. Claire gasped, then exhaled in relief, her eyes wide. "Good heavens! He's gentle." Daniel chuckled softly, the first smile breaking his otherwise composed face. "Looks like your partner here just won over the office." Ethan scratched behind Rook's ear, pride flickering in his eyes. "He's saved people before. He always knows when to step in." Caleb bent down to hug Rook, his laughter filling the quiet office. Claire, still embarrassed, thanked Ethan profusely before guiding her son out, leaving behind a moment of warmth in a room heavy with legal weight. Daniel watched the scene thoughtfully. "Incidents like that don't go unnoticed in a town like ours," he said. "A loyal dog saving a child, neighbors testifying to your care, a record of daily devotion. These are the stones we'll build your case on." Ethan felt his shoulders ease slightly, the storm inside him no longer entirely consuming. He still had nothing, no house, no money, no certainty. But with Daniel's strategy, Margaret's support, and Rook's presence, he had something to fight with. And for a father with nothing left, that was everything. The courthouse of Cedarbrook stood at the edge of Main Street, an old brick building whose weathered columns seemed to carry the weight of generations of disputes, inheritances, and broken families. On the morning of the hearing, gray clouds hung low, and a cold wind funneled through the courthouse square, rattling the flag above the steps. Ethan Walker climbed those steps slowly, each stride heavy. He carried Ella carefully in her carrier, bundled in Margaret's blanket, while Rook walked obediently at his side, his silver-black fur brushed and glistening, his amber eyes bright but serious. Though dogs were not typically allowed inside, Daniel Brooks had arranged for Rook to remain in the lobby, watched by Claire Morton, who had volunteered to keep an eye on him. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with the muted murmur of voices, shuffling papers, and the squeak of shoes against polished floors. Ethan took a seat beside Daniel, his heart pounding as he glanced across the aisle. There sat Madeline. She looked striking that morning, her blonde hair styled in soft waves, her makeup carefully applied to erase the fatigue that had once shadowed her face. She wore a fitted navy dress and pearls that gleamed at her throat, projecting the image of a composed young mother who had made mistakes but was ready to repair them. Beside her sat Victoria Thorne, her attorney. Victoria was in her early 50s, tall and commanding, with sharp cheekbones and jet-black hair streaked with silver, cut in a severe bob. Her suit was immaculate, her posture straight as a blade. Known in the county as a ruthless family lawyer, she had built her career dismantling opponents by turning their weaknesses into damning narratives. Years earlier, she had endured a bitter divorce herself, losing custody of her only son to her ex-husband, and the humiliation had hardened her into someone who wielded the courtroom like a weapon. Now, her dark eyes scanned Ethan with clinical detachment, as if she had already dissected his life into bullet points on a page. Judge Marianne Davis presided at the bench. She was a woman in her 60s, with graying hair pulled tightly into a bun, spectacles perched low on her nose, and an expression carved from stone. She was not unkind, but was famously unswayed by sentiment, preferring order, evidence, and pragmatism. Her robe draped around her like armor, and she tapped her pen lightly against the desk as she called the hearing to order. Daniel leaned toward Ethan. "Stay calm. Answer only when asked. Let me handle the arguments." The proceedings began with formal introductions. Then, to Ethan's dismay, Victoria Thorne rose first. She spoke with crisp precision, her voice carrying easily across the chamber. She painted Madeline not as a neglectful mother, but as a flawed woman struggling under the weight of postpartum depression, a condition that clouded judgment but did not erase her potential for recovery. She held up certificates proving Madeline had enrolled in a parenting class, spoke of her willingness to seek therapy, and stressed that what Ethan called abandonment was merely the mistake of a young mother overwhelmed without support. When Ethan heard these words, his fists clenched, but Daniel placed a steady hand on his arm, a silent reminder not to interrupt. Victoria's narrative then pivoted sharply. She described Ethan as unstable, a man who had only just returned from an out-of-town duty assignment with no permanent home of his own. His bank account, she pointed out, was nearly empty, his employment future uncertain. Your Honor, she concluded, family court is not about punishing betrayal. It is about stability, consistency, and the child's long-term well-being. My client, despite her struggles, is already taking corrective action. Mr. Walker, though honorable in his service, currently offers instability at best. Daniel rose in rebuttal. His voice was calm but steady, arguing that Ethan had cared for Ella faithfully since her mother cast her aside, that he had documented her feedings, her medicines, and her nights of illness. He called Margaret as a witness. The elderly woman walked slowly to the stand, her frame small against the backdrop of the courtroom, her voice soft but unwavering as she described how Madeline had left Ella in her care for months, barely visiting, and how Ethan had arrived desperate to protect his child. Victoria cross-examined with cutting questions, casting doubt on Margaret's memory, pointing to her age and frailty, even implying that grief over her own long-dead daughter might have colored her testimony. Margaret's hands trembled on the rail, her pale eyes glistening, but she did not back down. Yet Ethan could see the damage. Judge Davis's pen had not moved during her account, but it tapped twice when Victoria pointed out Ethan's lack of income. As the hours passed, Ethan's hope began to fray. He sat hunched, his hazel eyes fixed on Ella, asleep beside him, her tiny fists curled in innocence. He wanted to rise, to shout, to demand the court see the truth. But Daniel's hand remained steady on his arm, reminding him that law was not passion, it was patience. At last, Judge Davis removed her glasses, folded her hands, and spoke in a voice crisp as frost. Mr. Walker, the testimony today has been emotional and sincere. However, this court cannot base decisions on emotion. The evidence shows that you are recently returned from temporary assignment, that your financial situation is precarious, and that you lack a permanent residence. Mrs. Walker, though flawed, has taken steps toward improvement. The court hereby grants temporary custody to Mrs. Madeline Walker, with visitation rights for the father. We will review this matter in 30 days. Ethan felt the words like a physical blow. His vision blurred, his chest tightened. Across the room, Madeline's lips curved faintly, not into joy but into a subtle expression of triumph, while Victoria whispered something into her ear that made her shoulders straighten with confidence. The gavel struck. The session ended. Outside the courthouse, Ethan staggered down the steps, the carrier heavy in his arms, the cold wind whipping against his face. Daniel walked beside him, speaking words of reassurance. This is only the first battle, not the war, but they were muffled, as if underwater. Ethan lowered himself onto a bench, bowed his head, and let the despair wash over him. He had faced armed suspects without flinching, but here he sat, broken, stripped of the right to keep his daughter safe. Rook pressed close, resting his head against Ethan's knee, eyes lifted as if to remind him he was not alone. But the emptiness was vast, and for the first time since coming home, Ethan wondered if he could truly win. The days after the hearing passed like a blur for Ethan Walker. He spent his nights in the small shed when weather allowed, or in Margaret Holloway's spare parlor chair when she insisted he at least sleep under a proper roof. Each morning, he woke to silence more oppressive than any night patrol he had known as a police officer. Ella was with Madeline now, handed over at the courthouse's order, and the emptiness in his arms felt unbearable. Only Rook's steady presence beside him, the sound of claws clicking on the floorboards, or the gentle pressure of his head against Ethan's leg, reminded him that loyalty was not gone from the world. On the fourth morning, while Ethan sat at Margaret's kitchen table, staring at a cold cup of coffee, a knock came at the door. Margaret opened it to find a man in a trim charcoal suit, carrying a leather satchel. He was in his 50s, tall but slightly stooped, with thinning hair combed neatly, and a pair of spectacles perched on his nose. His name was Howard Greeley, a lawyer from a well-regarded firm in a neighboring county. Howard was known for his meticulous nature, the kind of man who never misplaced a paperclip, and for a calm manner that made even bad news sound like a polite observation. "Mr. Ethan Walker?" Howard asked politely when Margaret beckoned Ethan forward. His voice carried the precise diction of someone long accustomed to courtrooms. "I represent the estate of Charles Palmer." Ethan blinked. "My uncle?" He remembered the man only faintly. His father's older brother, a farmer with a reputation for solitude. He had lived alone on a large spread of land outside Cedarbrook, rarely visiting town except for supplies. Ethan hadn't seen him since childhood. Howard nodded, opening his satchel and producing a sealed envelope. "Your uncle passed away last month. You were named the sole beneficiary of his estate. That includes the Palmer farm, livestock assets, and certain investments. I've come to present the notice and arrange a formal review with you." Ethan sat down heavily, shock numbing his mind. For days he had been drowning, penniless, without a home. Now suddenly he was told he owned a farm, land, and income. It felt impossible. Margaret, standing behind him, placed her hand on his shoulder, her pale eyes shining with something close to hope. Howard continued with professional clarity. "The property is in need of attention. The barns are in disrepair, and the main house has not been occupied for years. Still, it is yours free of debt. I would suggest you visit the land soon. It could also play a substantial role in your custody proceedings, Mr. Walker." He gave a small bow, leaving the documents neatly stacked on the table before departing with quiet efficiency. That afternoon, Ethan drove out with Rook to the Palmer farm. The land stretched wide under the low winter sun, fields rolling toward the foothills, bordered by fences weathered but sturdy. The farmhouse loomed at the center, 2 stories of faded white clapboard, its porch sagging but still proud. Barns stood like silent sentinels, roofs caved in places, but the sheer expanse spoke of history and potential. Ethan parked by the overgrown drive and stepped out. The cold air smelled of pine and damp earth. Rook bounded forward, nose to the ground, tail high, exploring as though he too sensed something important here. The German shepherd's thick black and silver coat glistened in the pale light, his movements purposeful. At one barn, Rook stopped suddenly. Sniffing around a set of old wooden doors, his ears perked. With a low bark, he pressed his body against the door until it creaked open, revealing a dim interior. Ethan followed, ducking beneath a beam. Inside, among the dust and cobwebs, stood old equipment, rusted plows, broken crates, and a trunk against the far wall. Rook pawed at it, whining softly. Ethan knelt, brushing dust away, and opened the lid. Inside lay worn journals, leather covers cracked with age. They were his uncle's. He opened one carefully. The handwriting was rough but steady. Charles Palmer had written of his life in solitude, of losing his wife early to illness, of tending land while fighting off loneliness. One line caught Ethan's eyes. "A farm is not just land, it is legacy. Someone must carry it forward, or it dies. I pray one day it will fall into hands that remember duty." Ethan closed the book, his throat tight. His uncle had lived with ghosts, yet he had still believed in legacy. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt something other than despair. He felt responsibility, an inheritance not of wealth alone, but of duty. That evening, he walked through the farmhouse with Rook at his side. The floors creaked, wallpaper peeled, but sunlight through broken shutters revealed the bones of a home still standing. Upstairs, in a small room overlooking the fields, Ethan imagined a crib, a place where Ella could sleep safely, away from betrayal and courts. His chest tightened with both longing and determination. Margaret visited the next day, her frail frame wrapped in a thick coat, leaning on her cane. She walked slowly through the parlor, her eyes sweeping across the dust, but bright with wonder. "It's standing," she said simply. "Standing, waiting. Perhaps it was meant for you." She touched Ethan's hand, her grip light but steady. "This, Ethan, is what judges look for. Not just words, but walls and land, proof that you can build a future." Rook barked once from the porch, as though agreeing. He stood tall, ears forward, his body silhouetted against the wide stretch of fields. He had found the farm's hidden corners, sniffed its history, and now guarded it as if it were already home. For the first time since the night he was cast out, Ethan felt a spark kindle inside him. Not the fire of rage, but the steady flame of resolve. His wife had slammed the door. The court had judged him unfit, but now fate had handed him land, legacy, and a chance. He would not waste it. That night, he sat in the dim farmhouse kitchen, journal open, writing by flashlight. He recorded Ella's feedings, her cries, his every memory of her since the court hearing, as Daniel had told him. Yet his words carried more than duty now. They carried hope. The Palmer farm had begun to feel less like a graveyard of memories and more like the outline of a home. Ethan Walker spent each morning clearing weeds from the porch, nailing loose boards back into place, and coaxing the furnace in the old kitchen to life. Rook prowled the fields as though mapping every acre, his silver-black coat gleaming under the pale November sun. At night, Ethan sat at the wooden table with a lantern and his uncle's journal, reading about seasons past and the hard lessons of tending land alone. The entries steadied him. Duty, patience, endurance. Qualities his uncle had carried now fell onto Ethan's shoulders. One evening, after a long day repairing a broken fence post, Ethan heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He straightened, his hazel eyes narrowing as a sleek black sedan pulled into the drive. Rook growled low, his ears flat, his body already braced. The car door opened and out stepped Madeline. She wore no pearls, no careful smile now. Her blonde hair was unkempt, her eyes swollen from weeping, makeup streaked faintly on her pale cheeks. She had thrown a cardigan over a wrinkled dress, the kind of careless layering of someone who had not slept in days. When she spoke, her voice cracked. "Ethan," she said, clutching her purse strap so tightly her knuckles whitened. "Please, can we talk?" Ethan's stomach knotted. He hadn't seen her since the courtroom. Memories of her words, "I don't need her anymore," echoed like thunder. Still, he stood quietly as she walked closer, stopping a few feet away under the sagging porch roof. "I was wrong," Madeline whispered. "I wasn't myself. After Ella was born, I felt hollow, like everything had drained out of me. I let Mark in because he promised me escape. But he doesn't love me, Ethan. He never did. You're the only one I ever truly loved. Please, for Ella's sake, give me another chance. She needs her mother. We can start over." Her face, fragile and desperate, once might have broken him. But Ethan's expression was steady, carved from the weeks of betrayal and loneliness. He shook his head slowly. "Ella doesn't need lies, Madeline. She doesn't need to grow up in the storm you've created. I begged you to let me in, just to warm her, and you slammed the door. That was your truth." Madeline flinched as though struck. Tears filled her eyes, but before she could speak again, another engine roared. From the far side of the drive, a pickup truck screeched to a stop, gravel flying. Mark Halstead stepped out, his polished shoes sinking into mud, his perfect composure frayed. He was still tall, broad-shouldered, but his jaw was clenched, his face twisted with anger. His once slick dark hair was windblown, his expensive coat spattered with rain. "So, this is where you've been crawling off to?" Mark's voice was sharp, laced with contempt as he glared at Madeline. Begging him back? Pathetic. Madeline shrank, her shoulders curling inward, but Mark's eyes shifted to Ethan, cold and predatory. "You think this farm makes you strong? You think the court will care about your shack and your mutt? You're nothing, Walker, nothing." Rook stepped forward, teeth bared, a low snarl vibrating deep in his chest. His stance was taut, every muscle ready to spring. Ethan raised a hand slightly, calming him, but not easing the tension in his own jaw. "Leave," Ethan said evenly. "You don't belong here?" Mark sneered and stepped closer, his polished shoe splashing into a puddle near the porch. His hand twitched as though he longed to strike something. Someone. "You're going to regret crossing me. And you—" He jerked his chin at Madeline. "You had your chance. Don't come crawling back to me." Madeline's lips trembled. "Mark, please." But before she could finish, Mark raised his hand in a sudden, threatening gesture. Rook exploded forward, a blur of black and silver fur, planting himself between Ethan and Mark with a ferocious bark that echoed across the fields. His amber eyes blazed, his teeth glinting under the lantern light, every inch of him radiating warning. Mark stumbled back a step, his bravado faltering at the sheer force of the dog's presence. "You'd better control your animal," Mark spat, but his voice wavered. Ethan's eyes hardened. "Rook sees things for what they are, and right now, he sees exactly what I do." For a moment, silence hung heavy, broken only by Rook's growls and the hiss of wind through bare branches. Mark glared, but the certainty in his eyes had cracked. With a muttered curse, he turned, stormed back to his truck, and tore down the drive, mud spraying behind him. Madeline stood trembling, tears streaking her face, her entire frame seeming smaller under the porch light. She reached a hand toward Ethan, but he stepped back. His voice was quiet but final. "I don't hate you, Madeline, but there is no place for you in my life, in Ella's life, or in this home." Her hand dropped. She turned away slowly, shoulders shaking as she walked back to her car. The door slammed, the engine roared, and soon her taillights vanished into the darkness. Rook relaxed at last, though his body still quivered with the remnants of fury. He padded back to Ethan, pressed his head against his leg, and exhaled as if to release the weight of the moment. Ethan laid a hand on his loyal companion's back, feeling both the strength and the solace there. He looked out over the fields, the farmhouse behind him, and the night stretched wide and open. For the first time, he did not feel cornered. He felt resolute. Snow had begun to dust the rooftops of Cedarbrook by the time Ethan Walker returned to the courthouse for the second hearing. The morning air was sharp, carrying the sting of winter, and the town square buzzed faintly with murmurs. Neighbors, shopkeepers, even curious passers-by whispering about the farmer cop who had inherited land and was fighting for his daughter. Ethan walked up the courthouse steps with his head high, his uniform pressed, his shoulders squared. Beside him, Daniel Brooks carried a briefcase stuffed with documents and witness statements, his pale green eyes calm and focused. Rook trotted at Ethan's side, fur brushed clean, his black and silver coat catching the light like polished steel. Inside the courtroom, tension hung heavier than the snow-laden clouds outside. Madeline sat at the plaintiff's table again, her beauty now fragile under strain, her once perfect composure fractured by weeks of uncertainty. She wore a tailored gray dress, but her hands twisted nervously in her lap. Victoria Thorne, however, looked as formidable as ever, jet-black hair sharply angled at her jaw, eyes cold and cutting, her immaculate navy suit projecting control. Judge Marianne Davis entered with her usual stern poise, her robe flowing like a shadow as she took her seat. She scanned the courtroom, spectacles perched low, her pen ready. Daniel rose first, introducing evidence of Ethan's inheritance. He spread photographs across the table, the Palmer farm, the deed signed in Ethan's name, bank statements showing stability. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "Mr. Walker now has permanent residence, income from the land, and the ability to provide long-term security. Furthermore, we submit journals documenting every detail of his daughter's care during his custodial time." He then called Margaret Holloway again. The elderly neighbor, frail but determined, walked to the stand with her cane. This time her voice was steadier, bolstered by her admiration for Ethan's persistence. She spoke of seeing Ethan with Ella in the rain, of how he had kept the child alive when Madeline turned them away. Her pale blue eyes glistened, but her tone carried iron. Victoria Thorne countered with ferocity, painting Ethan's inheritance as sudden and untested, claiming land did not equal parental skill. She leaned on the idea that Madeline had enrolled in therapy and parenting classes. Yet, cracks began to show. Ethan's attorney produced evidence that Madeline had missed half her sessions. And then came testimony from a surprising witness, Claire Morton, Daniel's secretary. Claire, petite and freckled, spoke nervously at first, but when she recounted how Rook had saved her young son Caleb from falling in the office, her voice grew stronger. "That dog isn't just trained. He's protective, careful, and he mirrors his master. Mr. Walker is cut from the same cloth." The courtroom murmured softly. Even Judge Davis, raising her brows before motioning for silence. As the hearing dragged on, tension peaked when Mark Halstead barged into the courtroom, uninvited. He was disheveled, his once polished shoes scuffed, his dark hair untidy. His arrogance had crumbled since Ethan's rejection of Madeline weeks earlier. With a sneer, he tried to defend Madeline, muttering about Ethan being a stubborn brute who hides behind a dog. His tone, dripping with disdain, backfired. Judge Davis rapped her gavel sharply, ordering him removed, but not before his hostility toward Ella became clear to all. Gasps rippled through the crowd as whispers carried, this was the man Madeline had tied herself to. Through it all, Ethan remained silent, his hands folded, his hazel eyes fixed on the bench. Only once when Ella's name was spoken did his voice break the stillness. She deserves safety, stability, and love. I will give her all three. His words were not loud, but they carried weight. When the time came for closing remarks, Victoria Thorne still stood tall, delivering her arguments with her razor-sharp diction, but the ground had shifted. Her case leaned on hypotheticals and promises of improvement. Daniel's case leaned on proof, documents, witnesses, land, and devotion carved into daily records. Judge Davis sat in silence for a long while, her spectacles set aside, her eyes resting on Ethan. Then she spoke, her voice crisp but softened at its edges. Mr. Walker, the court acknowledges the dramatic change in your circumstances. You now have stable residence, income, and evidence of consistent care. Mrs. Walker, your efforts are noted, but your record is inconsistent. Based on the best interests of the child, this court grants full legal and physical custody of Ella Walker to her father, Mr. Ethan Walker. The gavel struck, final and unyielding. For a heartbeat, the room was utterly still. Then a swell of voices rose. Margaret clasped her hands, tears streaming. Daniel allowed himself the smallest smile of triumph. Claire, seated behind, let out a sigh of relief. Ethan lowered his head, his chest trembling, then looked down at Rook. The German shepherd's amber eyes gleamed, tail swishing once as if he too understood. Ethan bent and pressed his hand into Rook's fur, whispering, "We did it." Outside the courthouse, as snow drifted down in quiet flakes, people gathered in the square, murmuring not about scandal, but about resolve. Children reached to pet Rook, who stood patiently, tongue lolling slightly, every inch the guardian on four legs. To the townsfolk, he was no longer just Ethan's dog. He was part of a story of loyalty and redemption. Ethan lifted Ella from her carrier when Daniel placed her back in his arms, the infant's tiny fingers curling instinctively around his collar. He closed his eyes, the world narrowing to her warmth, her weight, her breath against his chest. For the first time since his return, hope was no longer a fragile spark. It was steady flame. The first true winter storm of the season had passed by the time Ethan Walker carried Ella across the porch of the Palmer farmhouse again. Snow draped the fields in glistening sheets, but sunlight pierced through the morning clouds, gilding the fences and barns in gold. The house was still worn, the wallpaper faded, but it no longer felt abandoned. Laughter had begun to echo within its walls, the kind of sound Ethan thought he might never hear again. After the custody victory, neighbors who once only watched quietly from porches began to stop by with offerings. Some brought wood for the furnace, others tools, others food. There was something magnetic about the story. A police officer betrayed, who stood back up, who fought for his daughter, and won. And at the center of every tale told in the market or at the diner was the image of the black and silver German shepherd, standing guard beside his master. One afternoon, Ethan met Sarah Whitmore, a woman in her early 40s who ran the town's general store. She was tall and slender, her dark hair streaked with gray, tied back in a neat braid. Her eyes were sharp but not unkind, shaped by years of keeping accounts balanced and shelves stocked in lean times. Sarah had once been a teacher before her husband's death forced her to take over the family shop. That loss had made her practical, steady, and wary of illusions. "If you need credit for nails or feed," she told Ethan with a firm nod, "you'll have it. You've already earned more than most men do in a lifetime." Volunteers began to gather on weekends. Daniel Brooks came, his glasses fogged in the cold as he hauled lumber and measured beams. Margaret Holloway, fragile but determined, sat by the kitchen fire, knitting blankets for Ella, her gnarled hands moving as if to stitch a piece of her heart into each loop. Even Claire Morton stopped by with Caleb, the boy who adored Rook and spent hours following the dog through the snow, shrieking with delight as the shepherd bounded like a guardian shadow. The barns were the first to change. With hammers and nails echoing against the winter air, they were patched and painted, converted into living quarters. Ethan had the idea to offer space for veterans returning with little more than uniforms and scars. It began small. One man, Jonas Miller, a former Marine in his 30s, broad-chested with a shaved head and haunted blue eyes, arrived with only a duffel bag. He rarely spoke at first, his voice gravelly, his posture tense as though waiting for ambush. But when he knelt to scratch Rook behind the ears and the dog leaned into his touch, something in his face eased. Within days, Jonas was repairing fences alongside Ethan, the rhythm of work replacing silence. Others followed. Word spread through the county. The Palmer farm had become more than a home. It was becoming a refuge. A young single father, Luis Ramirez, thin and wiry, with a tired smile and a toddler balanced on his hip, came seeking shelter. A widow named Helen Fraser, gray-haired with stooped shoulders but a laugh that carried warmth, brought baskets of canned goods and stories that filled long evenings. The farm became a patchwork of broken lives pieced together with labor, meals, and shared determination. Through it all, Ella grew. She was still fragile, but in the warmth of the farmhouse, her cheeks filled with color, her tiny hands reaching for Ethan's collar, or for Rook's fur whenever the dog padded close. Rook was tireless in his role, sleeping by her crib at night, rising to alert Ethan at the faintest whimper, playing patiently with Caleb and the other children who arrived. He was more than a protector. He was the spirit of the place, the steadfast guardian whose presence made others feel safe. On a brisk March morning, the townsfolk gathered at the entrance to the property. Ethan had carved a sign from oak, letters etched carefully into the wood. Haven Fields, where families begin again. He mounted it on the gate as snow melted into rivulets along the drive. Margaret stood beside him, her cane planted in the soft earth, her pale eyes shimmering with pride. Daniel shook his hand firmly, and Claire snapped a picture with her phone, capturing Ethan holding Ella in one arm while Rook sat tall at his side. The farm did not erase the pain of betrayal, but it transformed it. Ethan realized that family was not only blood. It was the old librarian who gave bread, the lawyer who carried his father's legacy, the secretary whose son laughed freely in the fields, the veterans who arrived with scars and left with purpose. And above all, it was the child sleeping peacefully in his arms, the little girl who would grow up never doubting her father's devotion. That night, Ethan sat at the old kitchen table, the journals of his uncle spread before him. He added his own words to the margins, his handwriting firm. Legacy is not land alone. Legacy is love, rebuilt brick by brick, even after ruin. He closed the journal, the lantern light flickering across his steady face. Rook lay at his feet, Ella asleep in her crib upstairs, the farmhouse alive with quiet. Outside, Haven Fields stretched beneath the moonlight, no longer a lonely estate, but a sanctuary. Ethan exhaled, shoulders finally loosening. The long road of betrayal and struggle had ended here, not with bitterness, but with a new beginning. And for the first time in his life, he felt not like a man surviving, but like a man at home. In the end, this story reminds us that even in the darkest nights, God can turn brokenness into blessing. What seemed like loss became a miracle. What felt like abandonment became the foundation of a new family. It is proof that with faith, perseverance, and love, no door closed by man can stay shut if God intends to open it. In our daily lives, we all face struggles, betrayals, and moments where hope feels lost. But just like Ethan, Ella, and their loyal German shepherd, we can trust that God's hand is guiding us to a place of healing and renewal. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs encouragement, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another message of hope. May God bless you and your family abundantly. And if you believe in the miracle of His love, type Amen in the comments.